Great. So everything is okay now. So good morning, good afternoon, good night, everyone, depending on the part of the planet you are joining us. So welcome to this amazing global dialogue of RC48. Thank you so much for all the people who are seeing us live streaming our social media channels, and of course for the people who are here in the call. And for me, it's a great pleasure to chair this session regarding responding to authoritarian legality and authoritarian trauma via social resilience and legal resistance. And we're going to address the case of Hong Kong. And this global dialogue was an initiative that our member Mandy Lee kindly suggests to do. And before starting the conversation, I want to publicly say thank you to Mandy for congratulate us here, for organizing all this amazing lineup of speakers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain a little bit the session that we have. We're going to have four parts, and the main two speakers who are going to intervene are Dr. Jan Ho Lai and Dr. Mandy Lee. Dr. Jan Ho Lai he will discuss, the emergence and consolidation of authoritarian legality in Hong Kong. He is a senior fellow of Georgetown Center for Asian Law, and he has been serving as a key driver of the city autocratization. He will also analyze how Hong Kong new authoritarian legality under the Chinese Communist Party rule poses the challenges to the realization of democratic autonomy, while simultaneously creating opportunities to build resilience through existing institutional and societal cracks. So that's going to be part of his intervention. And Mandy, who is an assistant professor at the School of Medicine and Trinity College Dublin, she will discuss the history of oppression-based social trauma that had been emerged across clinical and social sciences in recent decades, and how her concept of authoritarian trauma, really interesting category that we're going to explain, applies in Hong Kong since the city's rapid descent into authoritarianism rule since 2019. She will also discuss how social resilience is dynamic, communal, and political, and with international examples of communal healing practices. And finally, Mandy, she will present findings from her narrative inquiry research that showcase how Hong Kongers co-construct communal responses to repression to both talk and art. So you can see we are going to have had really interesting approaches to the case. And I'm going to give the floor to Eric, who is going to have 20 minutes to take us to the history of authoritarian legality in Hong Kong. As we say in the advertising, some sections are going to be in English, some section in Cantonese. I will provide all this, mix of flavors to our session. So Eric, you have the floor for 20 minutes. And once again, thank you everyone for coming along for this session today. So Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Camilo, and thank you, Mandy, for organizing this very timely and important session. And also thanks, Kim-Ann, for joining us as a discussant in the later sessions. And I'm Eric from Georgetown Center for Asian Law, and thank you everyone for joining on different platforms. And today is actually a very symbolic day for Hong Kong. It is the 6th anniversary of Hong Kong's imposition of the national security law by Beijing, and is the eve of the 29th anniversary of Hong Kong's sovereignty transfer from the British colonial rule to China, to the People's Republic of China. And if I may begin with a latest information published by a local newspaper, local media outlets in Hong Kong today, since the imposition of the national security law in 2020, as of now, the government has arrested at least 403 citizens in the name of safeguarding national security. And among these 403 individuals, 212 of them have been charged with security-related offenses. And more than 190 people were arrested, but yet charged. They are on police bail, but under the national security law, they are almost deprived of their freedom to travel outside Hong Kong, because now it's easy for the local law enforcement to confiscate their travel documents. And among these 403 individuals, at least 70 of them, at least 30 individuals among them were unknown to the public, because the government has also has the legal instruments to ensure some of these national security investigations are secret. They are not mandatory to disclose to the public for public access and public accountability. So all these practices since the imposition of national security law has drew global attention to law and society in Hong Kong, as well as how laws and courts has become an instrument of autocratization in this city. But in my 20 minutes or less than 20-minute presentation today, I'm trying to explain how these practices, or how these laws and courts in this new authoritarian order, or put it in a simple term, authoritarian legality, has evolved and has ever begun ever before 2020, before the national security law was imposed. So if I may share my screen, please let me know if you can't see the screen. Let me know if you can't see the. Yeah, thank you, Mandy.
Perfect, Eric.
Yeah. Great. So I will give a very brief overview of the history of authoritarian legality in Hong Kong. But of course, we need to conceptualize or define what does authoritarian legality mean in this case. And there are lots of contested concepts or conceptualizations of authoritarian legality. But to take a more broad and general definition of authoritarian legality, if I may quote from a recent book from Wei Shen Chen and Hua Ling Fu, two prominent legal scholars in Asia. Authoritarian legality refers to legality and the rule of law as promoted by strong authoritarian states, where a merely instrumental commitment to law could nonetheless develop and even solidified without radical democratic or political reform. It means that legality is not equivalent to the rule of law in liberal sense. It's more about legalism, and it's highly political, and is driven by the needs, or it is more driven by the needs of the autocratic state. It's more as the utility of laws and utility of courts merely serving for the political agenda or political functions of an autocratic regime, how it works. So they also make a very clear example, very clear analogy. Human rights abuses might be legalized, but as such, legalized abuse is definitely not the rule of law, because when we talk about the rule of law, from a very fundamental concept is equality before the law. Whoever you are, government officials or ordinary citizens, whoever you are, power holders or you are the powerless. And checking and balancing political powers is also a fundamental concept, fundamental principles in the rule of law. And separations of powers, limiting government, and all these liberal constitutional elements constitute how we understand the rule of law nowadays. But this concept of rule of law is, of course, contested in autocratic state, because from them, rule of law is simply an instrument of laws, instruments to uphold the legitimacy and stability of the autocratic rule. But in practice, how does authoritarian legality enforced? Apart from the law enforcement, one of the key actors in realizing authoritarian legality is the court, is the judiciary. And from many studies in political science and socio-legal studies, enforcing authoritarian legality in the court requires the judiciary to be compliant or to be functional, that in favor of the autocratic regime. And a very classic edited volume, Rule by Law, edited by Tom Ginsberg and Tamia Mustafa, has identified at least 5 functions of courts, of the judiciary under authoritarianism. First is to the courts would establish social control and silence opponents. And second, the court will bolster a regime's claim to legal legitimacy, that is to legitimize the existence and the operation of authoritarian regime. Thirdly, the court will strengthen administrative compliance and solve coordination problems within the government, within different departments, because even in authoritarian regimes, there are divisions. There could be competition within the regime, and the court will become a kind of arbiter of this. And the fourth function is to facilitate trade and investment, to try to present trading and investment and global economic activity in the jurisdiction is could still working as business as usual, to work as normal, despite the fact that the court has been instrumentalized to suppress political opponents. So it's really echoed the idea of the dual state proposed by Ernst Franco in the 1930s, when he observed how the Germany during the Nazis' time have instrumentalized the court on the one hand to make it as a prerogative, a mechanism to do whatever they want against the political enemies, but on the other hand, to keep a normative order of the judiciary to ensure that the country is still attractive to investment and economic activity. And finally, the court is serving to implement controversial policies to allow political distance of the executive. It means to absorb the political backlash if the government wants to introduce any unfavorable policies or legislations. And if this policy and legislation is endorsed by the court, then it helps boosting not just the government legitimacy, but also the credibility of such unfavorable legislation or policies. So if for this conceptual framework, I guess many of you can also associate how it applies to the courts and the judiciary in Hong Kong nowadays. And in recent scholarships, at least on comparative law and constitutional law and political science, the autocratization of courts does not only happen in authoritarian regimes. It also happens in hybrid regimes and countries suffering from democratic backsliding. And scholars commenced to identify this trend as a trend of autocratic legalism. Even for democratic states, for populist leaders in liberal democracies, they would have a trend to empower the executive government by introducing more laws and more legislations and regulations, and to weaken judicial and legislative checks, and to criminalize their opponents in the name of anti-nationalism, extremism, and counter-terrorism. And this example has always been revealed across European countries in the last decades when amid the rise of populism, and even in the US. And during the times of pandemic, the use of exceptional power has become a new norm for enhancing executive power at the expense of checks and balances. And amid these theoretical foundations or motivations, I guess discussing the case of Hong Kong is very essential, but we also need to be mindful of two caveats. In the first place, Hong Kong has earned the high ranking of rule of law and judicial independence in the past decades, but ironically, such a high ranking of the rule of law and judicial independence does not rely on the robustness of a democratic institutions in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has never enjoyed a full democracy during whatever in the British colonial times or now in a post-colonial or under the Chinese communist rule. And such high ranking of the rule of law and judicial independence were highly dependent on the performance of the court in commercial and in settling commercial and financial disputes. And on the other hand, its high ranking also depend on the institutional defects in Hong Kong. Ironically, because from a liberal perspective, judicial independence is safeguarded by a democratic accountability, and vice versa. Democratic accountability is protected when there's an independent judiciary to checks and balance executive power. But if this order was not fully manifested in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has not enjoyed the full democracy in the past. And then other caveats that Hong Kong's struggle for democracy in the previous decades, I guess Mandy and Kim will chime in more. This democratization movement was driven by a promise under the Basic Law promulgated by the People's Republic of China. And such democratization movement was not based on the fact that Hong Kong was not a sovereign state. So in terms of comparative law or in a comparative analysis, there's always tensions whether Hong Kong shall be treated as a comparator in comparative politics or in comparative law when the legal jurisdictions of Hong Kong has not backed it by its own sovereignty, but the sovereignty comes from Beijing. And because of this colonial history, the legacies of the British colonial rule remain in effect after the handover, after the sovereignty transfer in 1997. And for example, the public order law that was used to arrest more than 10,000 protesters in Hong Kong during the 2019 protests was originated from the British colonial rule when they used this law to combat the anti-government riot driven by the CCP in 1967. And another key legacy of the British colonial rule is that even the British colonial administration has established a strong human rights protection framework in the late colonial era. But this human rights protection framework was limited by the fact that it does not allow the local people to enjoy the right to self-determination. And in the geopolitical history in 1970s and 80s, we also saw that China, once it became a member of the United States, it immediately asked the authorities to remove Hong Kong and Macau from the list of territorial autonomies in the United Nations so that they are not entitled to the right to self-determination. So this is an inadequate or is an incomplete protections of democratic future and incomplete protections of human rights under international standards. And because of this background, when Hong Kong sovereignty was transferred to the PRC on the 1st of July 1997, there have been a lot of loopholes on the local legal and constitutional orders that allowed Beijing, the autocratic sovereign state, to intervene in the local legal and constitutional disputes. For example, in the past few decades, especially after President Xi Jinping came to power, introducing a lot of ideological imperatives becomes the new norm in the local city, including the introduction of the idea of the holistic concept of national security, 總體國家安全觀, and the ideas of overall jurisdictions, 全面管治權, and weaponizations of laws, 法律武器化, and rule-based governance, 依法治國. All these concepts from Beijing, from mainland China, are introduced and transplanted into Hong Kong. And to tell the local public that the one country, two system formula that was based on the premises that Beijing remains as an absolute sovereign state and any autonomy or freedom Hong Kong could enjoy depend on the authorizations or the authorization of the central people's government. And then other key backdrop that enable authoritarian legality in Hong Kong is the one country, two system formula, because as I mentioned, many of the British colonial legacies remain in effect. It was because the one country, two system formula settled during the political transition period was aiming at preserving most of the pre-existing architecture in Hong Kong, including the common law, including a free market, including undemocratic administrations, and as well as draconian repressive legal instruments in the city. So in a way, even though China claimed that Hong Kong sovereignty transfer or Hong Kong's handover was a success or a victory of Hong Kong's decolonization, but it was not true. Ironically, this is a transitional arrangement. It's also a reflection of an unfinished genuine decolonization in Hong Kong. So, and because of this power differentials, this power structure, the basic law in Hong Kong, even though it has a liberal element, it has also a lot of loopholes that enable the autocratic state to intervene in local affairs. And the executive judicial relations in Hong Kong has been intense ever since the handover, because on the one hand, the local judiciary, nurtured by the British colonial legacies, have been enjoying a strong judicial freedom and judicial autonomy. But on the other hand, when it comes to constitutional and political affairs taken into the court, Beijing will have a stronger sense that they will want to see the presence of their judicial sovereignty in the matter. And this conflict has led to different forms of executive judicial tensions in the past few decades, and the imposition of the national security law was a way for Beijing to try to settle this tension by imposing more regulations and restrictions on the local courts in order for the executive authorities to ensure the process and outcome of any security-related trials in the city. And apart from this direct imposition of authoritarian legality from China to Hong Kong, Beijing has also been employing different forms of tactics elite cooptation or the United Fronts were to ensure they have allies to implement or to rationalize, to justify all these practices of authoritarian legality in the city. And when Beijing imposed a national security law in 2020, I would argue it's not simply an imposition of law. It's always about the law, but not just about the law. I also wrote an article in the Taiwan Human Rights Journal with this title, because the national security law was embedded with a new ecosystem that not just the law enforcement, not just the judiciary are implementing or carrying out the ideas and practices of safeguarding regime security of Beijing in Hong Kong, but they are also connecting different forces and different government agencies to try to impose a new apparatus and a new ecosystem to ensure everyone are succumbed to this national security order, or to make it more explicit, is the political security order. And of course, there are different features of how this national security ecosystem work. And with this short presentation, I'm not going to in detail, but to highlight several features. The statutes and regulations are the key drivers that the government, both from Beijing and from the local Hong Kong government, are legalizing repressions in different forms of legislations or executive regulations, including the introductions of 2 national security laws with broadly defined offenses and broadly defined security concepts, and as well as introducing more regulations to censor arts and cultural industry, free-making industry, small and medium businesses, and introducing more legislations not just to restrict the freedom of the people, but to enable more arbitrary powers of the government agencies in order for them to carry out their political agenda with less restrictions and more discretions. And
Eric, you have 5 minutes. Sorry, thank you. 5 minutes.
Yeah. The judiciary in Hong Kong has also shifted from the guardians of rights that was highly appreciated during the British colonial times to become the guardian of the state, because now they rarely cited international human rights jurisprudence to adjudicate criminal cases and civil cases related to constitutional rights or related to rights to protest or rights to free speech, but rather they are now more adjacent to the imperative and narratives of the government to try to highlight all speech-related activities, many speech-related activities as a threat to national security, even if they are not inciting violence. And even in many of these security-related verdicts, they are simply incorporating government narratives against the local democratization movement and local opposition figure as a way to justify a tough and harsh sentencing of these individuals and organizations. And of course, elite cooptation and repression has also become much stronger than before, when they are exerting new practices or new legislation to try to regulate professions, to curb their professional autonomy, and in order to have greater professional control on social workers, on accountants, and use different indirect ways to try to tame other professionals, say academics or lawyers. And of course, ideological education has become a new norm, that they want to spread or disseminate the ideas of holistic national security and soft resistance to different facets of society to ensure they are complying with the state imperatives. And I must highlight, all these practices are not simply driven by governments, but also by state-sponsored elites or state-adjacent elites, including some former sociologists from Hong Kong. Lau Siu Kai now is seen as a mastermind of many security policies on Hong Kong, and he is introducing 16 concepts, 16 elements of how soft resistance could be constituted. And we can discuss further in the Q&A session. But last but not the least, what I'm trying to say in the last slide is this authoritarian legality has also created new psychological warfare to the local community, because the use of the national security laws and the use of these discretion powers by the national security police has created a lot of emotional repressions or emotional traumas to the local individuals and communities. And when the national security law allows individuals to try to receive a low to lighter sentencing if they turn against their former colleagues by being prosecution witnesses, it creates not just internal divisions but also a shame for those who wish to be released early, but they have to turn against their former colleagues, and this shame has led to people inclining to surrender to the regime in order to regain their personal freedom. And the sense of guilt was also strong when individuals were targeted by the national security law, especially when the government are using the law in an extraterritorial way, or what we call transnational repression. One recent case was obvious that a father of an exile activist was imprisoned for 7 months just because he was convicted of supporting her child's insurance policy, and that was in breach of the national security law already. And he was sentenced to jail. And this practice has not made that exile activist to withdraw her work, but it creates a new norm and a new pattern that the government would target family members for collective punishment in a way to pressurize exile or overseas communities to withdraw from of anti-authoritarian activities. And last but not least, of course, is inducing the sense of fear and creating distrust. When the government, under the national security law, introduced a national security hotline for everyone to report to the police about activities that they deem as a threat to national security. And periodically, the government would update the number of messages they received from the national security hotline, whatever, from workplaces, from schools, from neighborhoods, from wherever you name it. And they have been collecting hundreds and thousands and millions of messages. That it creates a sense of censorship and surveillance in the city, and the fear has either driven people to relocate from Hong Kong to other countries, or to live in a strong sense of self-censorship. Otherwise, they may have to pay for the cost for being outspoken or being publicly active in civic engagement. And this sense of psychological warfare, I guess, has created a more long-term impact of the Hong Kong society, because it has fundamentally shifted the norms of the local community from being vibrant, pluralistic, and open, and being critical for the benefits of the common good, to becoming self-censored, to becoming tamed by this new political and legal order. And
Thank you, Eric. Sorry, Eric, you have 1 minute. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. Yeah, this is my last slide. So I couldn't explain further in my presentation, but if you're interested, I published a book last year on titled Legal Resistance Under Authoritarianism, first published by Amsterdam University Press. So I also documented more tactics of how China transplant its authoritarian legality into Hong Kong in different domains. So if you're interested, you can get a book from your library, or get a paperback from online, and we can further discuss on this matter during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Eric, thank you to you for this amazing presentation and for kicking off the conversation. It was really, really, really interesting. And for the people who are just joining us, this is the first part of our conversation, where Eric was presenting the history of authoritarian legality in Hong Kong. I forgot to say, I'm sorry for that one of our main discussants is Professor Chan Kin-man, who is the president of the Taiwan Society for Hong Kong Studies, and he is going to provide the first discussions after the second part that is going to be delivered by Mandy in 2 seconds. And the second part is going to be regarding authoritarian trauma as a form of oppression-based social trauma. And Hong Kong and international perspectives will be, of course, the case study that Mandy is going to address. So Mandy, thank you once again for organizing this global conversation, and you will have 20 minutes. And after these 20 minutes, I will pass the floor to Professor Kin-man to do the first introduction of discussions. And please, people in the chat, be free to put any kind of questions or comments that you want for the presentations. So Mandy, the floor is yours. And just 2 seconds, just in order to don't be so disruptive, I'm going to use this, I don't know, emoji, whatever, that is a heart, just to let you know that you have 5 minutes, and after that for a minute. So
Camilo, you can just speak up. Actually, I would rather you actually speak up to interrupt me. Yeah,
Perfect.
thank you so much.
We interrupt you in 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. That would be great. So thank you so much, Camilo, for having us, and in fact, to the ISA RC48 on social movements, collective action, and social change for allowing these global dialogues to happen. And thank you so much to everyone who is on the various platforms and also those joining us on the chat. And I'm really grateful for Eric's presentation just now, really outlining the whole ecosystem of the national security law in Hong Kong since 2020. And as Eric mentioned, today is actually the 5th anniversary of that law being, how can I say, applied in Hong Kong. So I am a sociologist of health and illness, so I take a slightly maybe different approach to Eric. As a legal scholar, I look at actually how we, as community members of Hong Kong, how do we respond to the repression? How do we react to it, and how do we respond to it? So I'm going to share my slide very quickly, if you don't mind. Okay, I'm just going to do this now. You can see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to... Okay, so yeah, so very quickly, I mean, I may not have time to actually go through basically how I started researching into Hong Kong. But one thing I would like to quickly say is that I'm obviously not the only person who is looking into this. And it was interesting how Eric mentioned there was another sociologist, but basically using his disciplinary knowledge in the service of the regime, him acting as an agent for repression. I'm very lucky that the people that I've met in both my university and with diasporic members of the Hong Kong community, we are also trying to use our professional knowledge, but hopefully for freedom and democratic justice. But what I would like to say is that social trauma is actually not as, I suppose, as popularly understood and popularly actually researched as we might have thought, because just to give an overview of our sorry, I can't go to the next slide. Okay, just to give an overview of trauma studies in general. Trauma studies, especially in the clinical sciences, trauma has been very much dominated by psychological disciplines over the years. Obviously, you have people with different kind of expertise in psychology and psychiatry, and even in social psychology and political psychology, unfortunately, a lot of times trauma, as it has been clinically understood, has been very much focused at the individual level. So I think a lot of the people in our audience, both in Hong Kong and internationally, will have heard of the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And also there is the more sophisticated diagnosis of complex PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which begins to take into account the impact of the social environment on the individual. But the key thing is that a lot of these diagnostic categories are in fact still measured at the individual level. So even when we talk about complex PTSD, it is about how the environment acted on the individual to how can I say to make a person have stress symptoms or how can I say have depressive symptoms, etc. So as a sociologist and as a sociologist health and illness, this is where we come in because trauma really has not been properly understood or investigated as social trauma or even collective trauma, basically where we need to understand it as a product of social processes rather than simply as aggregates of individual assessments. I think this is the key fundamental difference that we need to make. Even as recently as last year, literally, there has been the International Society of Political Psychology conference and academy that I attended, where there was a presentation on war trauma assessment, and even at that level of looking at war trauma, the items in the scale is very much focused on what has directly happened to the individual. So, it could be that the person may have been forced to leave or that they may have suffered actual physical injury, but they are all to do with direct direct impact on the individual. And this regards even the phenomenon of vicarious trauma, whereby even as witnesses to, injustice or traumatic events in the community, we are also negatively affected. So this is where I'm thinking, sociology of health and illness can really contribute. And also it's not just sociology as well, it's also arts and humanities. Now, what was interesting about trauma studies is that it really is a very diverse field. And I'm sure, especially for people coming from the arts and humanities, trauma theory is something that, is a very vibrant stream of research in history, in memory studies, in anthropology. And trauma theory itself also has very much been dominated by psychoanalytic theories, for example, by Caruth in the 1990s. In sociology, the sociological contribution to trauma studies really, officially occurred in the early 2000s by Jeffrey Alexander, Warren Eierman et al. They basically pioneered the concept of cultural trauma. And the thing is, when you look at cultural trauma, and how they have defined it, it's very much that early sociological thinking is very much about thinking about trauma being predicated upon an extraordinary event. So, for example, you can see these quotes here. Cultural trauma occurs when members of a collective feel they have been subjected to a horrendous event that leaves indelible marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. So that literally is a quote drawn from the key textbook by Alexander et al. Back in 2004. And then Eierman talk about like how cultural trauma represents a tear in the social fabric, and Hirschberger, coming from a more historical sociology perspective, talk about collective trauma as a cataclysmic event that shatters the basic fabric of society, where it is a crisis in meaning. Now, all of these are in fact very, I suppose, intuitive for us. A lot of times when we think about trauma, the word comes from the origin of the word came from the word wound. 一個創傷, something happened that caused a wound in the social fabric in this case. But actually there has been a lot of criticisms against this kind of event-based model of trauma. Now, but before I go into that, but even if you think about what Hong Kongers have experienced since 2019, there have been some clinical evidence to show that we as a community have experienced severe trauma since the crackdown on the 2019 mass protests, and also the introduction of that was the mass protest was over the introduction of the extradition law. But basically, there was a Lancet study in 2020 that charted in mental health challenges experienced by Hong Kongers, comparing data from 2009 to 2019, which identified a major mental health burden during that what they call social unrest in Hong Kong, with probable depression reported by 11.2% of participants in 2019, compared to only 1.9% in the period prior. And also there was a prevalence of suspected PTSD in 2019, which was estimated at around 12.8%, which was also very elevated for the population. After that, that study in 2020, there also had been another major mental health survey of protest participants, with almost 80,000 participants in this huge survey research that was conducted by Li et al. In 2021, which reported these protest participants, even amongst people with very low degree of protest participation, so people literally maybe have gone on a march, on a peaceful march, etc., they reported significant levels of depression, anxiety, and symptoms of traumatic stress. Now, again, the reason why, so there is clinically this evidence to show that Hong Kongers have been traumatized, since 2019. But from my perspective as a sociologist, health and illness, that is actually not enough to really explain what has been going on. Again, you can see that in terms of the study design, these studies are very much based on self-reported symptoms of stress, symptoms of traumatic stress by individuals. So when we talk about how a population as a whole has been traumatized, we're talking about aggregating all these individual measurements of how individuals have been, personally affected by what has been happening, and then saying, okay, Hong Kong society as a whole is in fact traumatized, which I completely agree from how can I say that, in terms of proper clinical evidence, but then I'm also looking at communally what are we experiencing. So going back to what we're saying about evolutions in kind of how we think about trauma. So a lot of times it is easy for us to think about trauma in terms of physical trauma. Like, for example, this is a painting by the Hong Kong artist couple, Lummi Lam Long. This is actually them in the picture themselves. They put themselves in the picture. They have personally experienced where they have been fired at by riot police in Hong Kong during 2019. So physical trauma, this is very much, very uneasily understood trauma. There is also first-person trauma, this is where, actual protesters, they may feel traumatized, or they feel tired, or they feel depressed, or whatever it is. They go on marches and then they feel that. Or they could also be vicarious trauma, though, which is where even members of our Hong Kong community, even as witnesses to injustice, witnesses to harm being done, we cannot help but cry in our beds when we watch all these things unveiling in live streams, etc., etc. So these two graphics are done by Fei Wangzer, and again, in particular in this one, this one which has been has gone viral in 2019 as an image. He was really basically illustrating his own personal experience, but it found resonance across the whole of Hong Kong society, and that's why his image had gone viral. So because basically a lot of us are actually experiencing that, whether we are in Hong Kong physically or outside of Hong Kong. So this is what I want to say, is that another form of trauma is also authoritarian trauma, which is a form of oppression-based trauma. And what is oppression-based trauma? So oppression-based trauma by a group of liberation psychologists who have proposed this concept back in 2016, so exactly 10 years ago. They call for the recognition of oppression-based trauma, which focuses attention on the systemic, institutional, and psychological trauma outside of the immediate threat of physical injury or death. So, so the idea is that we already have the evidence that oppression has a negative impact on the mental health of its targets. Like we've seen this clinically in Hong Kong, as I mentioned. But we want to focus on oppression-based because really it is the systems and the institutions that are causing harm, psychological harm to communities. Now, the specific forms of oppression that have been mentioned by Holmes in their basically that exemplary article, they talk about gender-based oppression and also racial oppression, and they also mention international oppression in the case of the military occupation of Palestine. My critique is that international oppression is definitely, absolutely completely relevant, but at least in terms of our own experience of what has been happening in Hong Kong, oppression can come from our own regime and institutions, and it has been obviously happening a lot in different countries around the world where we are experiencing democratic backsliding. So this is why I would like to focus on authoritarian trauma as a form of oppression-based trauma. And so when we talk about different forms of political repression, and again, this is something Eric had mentioned in his presentation, it doesn't just come from the state. The key thing to understand is that it could be from both state and non-state actors. It could be state or private actions. And you could talk about political repression that affects any form of political participation, including both institutional and institutional participation. You also could be, so the political repression could be acting upon the whole community, whether or not you identify yourself as an activist. Obviously, there are also social movement repression targeted against, especially name brand, high profile activists. And that is the kind of psychological warfare that Eric described at the end of his presentation, where family members have been threatened, family members of activists have been threatened as an example of transnational repression. But there's also private repression actions by non-government governmental actors that raise the cause of activism and or protest. So that kind of the hotline that was also mentioned by Eric earlier is an example of that. But it is part of a repression that has been institutionally supported because, the hotline is actually set up by the regime. So what I mean by authoritarian trauma, one of the key things to recognize from my perspective is that it is distinct from, but can be connected to racial and gender-based trauma as corollary to the oppressive ideology of an authoritarian regime. What we know about authoritarian regime is that they are very good at dividing and ruling people. So they will set up kind of ethnic based kind of divisions amongst the people to prevent solidarity happening across different communities. But the key thing is when we talk about oppression-based trauma is borrowing a concept from racial oppression is this idea, gender and racial oppression is this idea of microaggressions. So these are the kind of everyday lived experiences of where there are very kind of low-level state harassments against peoples and communities and local businesses, etc., etc. The key thing is that authoritarian trauma is a collective social trauma in the present tense. It's not just an event that happened dramatically in the past, and we are now trying to make sense of it, which is a lot of what historical trauma theory is about. I'm talking about everyday ongoing repression. So it's not one singular cataclysmic event. It is a series of continuing small level of repressive episodes that have been experienced by members of the community. And the key thing is it does not matter if you identify yourself as part of the movement or not. As long as, in this case, maybe if we identify ourselves as Hong Konger, then we are being repressed because our ethnic heritage and our ethnic identity is the target of that repression. So there's been a quote by Bon and Krebs. If PTSD is condition triggered in the present by past events, remember we say PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. This is about something that happened after that maybe violent episode of being attacked, for example, then you suffer PTSD afterwards. Well, then that's not enough to explain what is going on right now in Hong Kong. So authoritarian trauma is a condition triggered in the present by current events. So this focus on the present tense and ongoing is what we need to really focus on. And the idea is that suppression and destruction of civil society institutions by a powerful regime, as well as wholesale restrictions of rights and harassments, also basically require therapeutic redress at the societal and political levels. So I may not have time. I'm not going to go through all of this, but again, I borrow some of my theorizing about authoritarian trauma from one key author, Dr. Salman Jabbar in Palestine. She is a psychiatrist in terms of her discipline, and she wrote a lot about trauma of humiliation. And in fact, recently she wrote about wanting to rephrase PTSD into chronic stress disorder as opposed to post-traumatic stress disorder. But one of the things that we can learn from the Palestinian experience is how they talk about how the pervasive and fundamental experience of the Palestinian people under occupation is this trauma of humiliation. So again, I could see parallels with what has been happening in Hong Kong in terms of this pervasiveness and fundamental experience of us as Hong Kongers living in Hong Kong, and also increasingly those of us who live outside of Hong Kong, as long as we identify as being a Hong Konger. And that the idea is that the regime control all elements of life that impose losses and injuries upon every Palestinian. So it really doesn't matter. It's not about individuals so much. It is about the community as a whole. And it is about daily contact. In this case, harassment of Palestinian public by Israeli forces in their daily contacts. So yeah, it is a neglected form of political violence, but I will move on. In the Hong Kong context, now I'm using this chronology events up to 2023. This is based on a book that was published by a Hong Kong journalist. It says deliberately to be continued because this is still, as an echo what I was saying about, this is a repression that is continuing. So when we talk about collective social trauma in 2019 in Hong Kong since the repression, it's not just the persecution of democracy activists, like the bounty that have been placed on various activist heads. there had been a crackdown on independent free press. Most notable of that, it was the collapse of Apple Daily, and then the persecution of Jimmy Lai and other journalists and editors of other independent free press. There's also the dissolution of civil society institutions. So, for example, Wallflower, which was a prisoner advocacy NGO that was set up by a former Democrat legislator, it was also forced to shut down. Also repression on university campuses and an arrest and imprisonment for speech crimes and expression of our Hong Konger ethnic identity. So again, there have been instances of where National Security Police arrested members of speech and language therapists from publishing a series of children's books. 呢個係羊村繪本嗰個案啦。And then there was also a man was sentenced to 8 months jail for sharing videos relating to sporting events, playing the wrong national anthem on social media. So it's this kind of daily assault on basically on our identity as Hong Kongers, but also on our civic institutions as well. So this is an example of that, literally the regime very much explaining things in black and white. If you are displaying flags or banners or chanting slogans or conducting yourselves with an intent, such as secession, subversion, etc., etc. So the idea is that it's not just speech crimes that we can be prosecuted for, but also thought crimes. And thought crimes is whatever the regime thought of us as actually, carrying out. So so this is what I want to say here in terms of the how can I say the non-state actor. So we all know ourselves as Hong Kongers that the candlelight vigil in the Victoria Park has been banned, and even during 2020, Hong Kongers tried to divide police. This is actually at the time of the COVID pandemic. So the physical banning of the protest, that's from the regime, that is very much as opposed to be expected. But what was actually also of note is how non-state actors are also involved in this. They, for example, since 2024, they have been using the organizing a food carnival in the space where we used to have the candlelight vigil. So these are pro-regime groups holding these kind of food festivals, which try to erase our public memory of our civic struggle that had happened for over decades. So it is this, and you will say, well, okay, we are not directly affected by it, and in fact, you can have individuals in Hong Kong who would be like shut themselves off from this kind of news, who may be thinking, oh well, this doesn't bother me, it doesn't affect me, I'm not impacted. But the key thing is that it actually the loss of civic institutions is part of how our community as a whole is being repressed, and it actually does have an impact on our communal mental health, as I will show later on. Most recently, we all know about the Hong Kong fire, I hope, last November, literally, where a housing estate has gone on a fire, and it was very much seen as man-made in the sense that it was through kind of dereliction and negligence from various government departments that led to the situation that we had seen. And one of the things that was interesting just even recently was about how the suppression of public mourning. So this was a student union notice board in Hong Kong, basically saying that we are deeply saddened and we want to mourn the deaths of the Wang Fuk Court fire disasters, and we are Hong Kongers, when that we sincerely ask the government to respond to the public so that justice can be served. So that's a very, it was really asking the government in a really polite way to ask them to respond. But then you can see this is what happened. What was ironic is that very quickly afterwards, these posters, these words were blocked. See this series of notice boards being used to block what was actually supposed to be the democracy war of the student union notice board at a university. Again, we actually
you will have 5 minutes. Sorry,
okay. I'm almost. Thank you. So the other thing is about calls for accountability for online petition and creation of a community archive. Also led to persecution of Hong Kong university students. So there are 2 students who have been, who are actually suffering from how can I say that, being essentially. Well, one student was officially, how can I say that, I suppose, being complained about in terms of the doxing incident where she was the whistleblower on an academic integrity scandal, and then another student was really very much the initiator of an online petition asking for accountability over the Hong Kong fire incident. And then both students have been persecuted in the sense that the student here was not allowed to have his degree, despite the fact that he completed all his academic credits. And the student here was basically, she originally, how can I say that, initiated a communal archive of materials relating to the Hong Kong fire. And then she basically are no longer able to do that anymore. So I want to show how does that affect us and what had that impacted us. So these are some Cantonese quotes from a anonymous narrative survey that I have as part of my research. And I'm only choosing quotes from people who have already left Hong Kong. So and all the quotes are in fact all anonymized. But one of the things that you can see here, 我繼續留喺香港，個人只會黐線，我冇得揀，必須離開. So basically what the person is saying, if I continue to stay in Hong Kong, I will go crazy. Literally, that was kind of her emotional reaction. I don't want my sons to live in a place where freedom is impossible. So even if, how can I say that, the persons may not be directly affected, but the impact, the national security ecosystem that Eric talked about in his presentation is what is in fact, how can I say that, preventing the rest of us from being exercising our rights fully. One person says, I do not want to go to jail. We may not be the ones currently targeted now at this time, but the key thing is that we might become targets. And that is really what this kind of authoritarian trauma is about, is that even if we are not directly impacted by incidents of harassment and repression now, the key thing is that we might also be impacted. So this is the idea of殺雞 So I don't know, so somebody have to, because我啲中文可能唔係太好，呢個係點樣啊？殺雞儆猴。好多謝你 Kim， 係啦，殺雞儆猴呢個 effect. So the idea is that individuals may be made an example of as a warning to the rest of the community. And then there's also how can I say that, another one, another quote is basically which is really funny in a sense that this person says, I don't want to fight with pigs. 我唔想同豬打交. The idea that if you are being entangled in that national security ecosystem, like you're fighting with how can I say, you're getting entangled with something that is never ending, and 糾纏簡直和豬打架一樣。我哋有冇武裝力量? And then the idea is that the Hong Kong political environment, civil society, legislative system has been rapidly, how can I say that, being destroyed. Our freedom of expression has been completely taken away. Everything makes people feel suffocated. So there's this idea of being suffocated and not being able to exercise our rights that is actually what is happening, impacting in Hong Kong at the moment. So I realize that I may not have a lot of times, but I want to show, in terms of the take-home message, is that oppression-based social trauma affects the community collectively, with both state and non-state actors acting as agents of oppression, with negative impacts on communal health, even on those not directly impacted or affected. And so that is it. Sorry, that is really it. I should stop sharing and I will leave to.
Thank you, Mandy, for that amazing presentation and for giving us all this other perspective regarding what's happening in Hong Kong and all these ideas about collective trauma, authoritarian trauma. Really, really interesting. What we're going to do now is I'm going to give the floor to Professor Chan Kim-man, who is the president of the Taiwan Society for Hong Kong Studies. Professor, thank you so much for being with us today. And you're going to have 10 minutes to provide your comments. And after that, I will give the floor to some of you. If you want, maybe we can collect 2-3 questions. We'll have a break and go to the second part. And just to let you know, we have 503 people watching us at the moment in different platforms. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for the people who are here directly in the call. So Professor Kim-man, thank you once once again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Camilo. Since this section is a bilingual section, if I may, I will give my commentary in Cantonese. All right.
No problem.
首先就多謝Eric 非常之有系統嘅一個presentation 啦嚇。咁Eric 基本上講嘅咧就話一種所謂專制社會下邊嘅一種嘅法律制度咧，其實就唔係我哋以往所想像嗰種所謂 rule of law， 即係法治。佢基本上即係一種 rule by law， 即係話以法制人嘅一種咁樣嘅法律嘅體制。咁喺佢嘅 presentation 裏邊咧，佢會講到有關所謂 legal legitimacy， 即係話咧，佢希望透過呢一個新嘅法律制度，特別講國安法等等咧，係提供一種政府執法嘅一種所謂正當性。咁我主要就係環繞呢一個嘅概念咧，想提一啲嘅諗法出嚟。即係當政府係去到制定咗國安法之後，究竟係咪啲人就大家覺得而家政府做緊嘅事情就係一個合法合理嘅狀況咧？睇上嚟好多支持民主自由嘅人咧，並唔因為國安法出咗嚟之後咧，就會覺得而家政府所執法或者所用嘅權力係一種正當嘅情況嚟嘅。更多人係會覺得呢種係一種惡法苛政猛於虎等等咁樣。並唔見得到咧，好多主流嘅社會嘅人咧係接受咗呢一個而家嘅情況咧，已經係 rule by law。既然係咁嘅話，咁點解政府仲係要不斷咁講呢種所謂以法治港亦都認為咧咁樣提供咗俾佢嘅所謂執法嘅或者所謂嘅權力嘅正當性咧？呢個我覺得要翻到去 James Scott 裏邊咧，佢喺就 Weapons of the Weak 嗰裏邊去講咧，其實好多時候一個所謂官方嘅意識形態咧，佢個目的咧根本唔係去說服嘅嗰啲絕大多數嘅被統治者，嗰扎嘅被統治嘅人咧，其實好多人都有相當之清醒嘅頭腦啦，知道呢一啲咧其實只係為咗個政權咧去到進行一種裝飾嘅啫。咁但係既然係咁嘅話，點解仲要繼續不斷咁講呢種以法乜乜、以法治港呢種咁講法咧？咁樣其實如果用 James Scott 嘅講法咧，佢最重要係為咗團結嗰啲所謂統治者階層，即係話咧喺好多執法嘅人，無論佢係法官、佢係警察、佢係呢個主控官、佢可能係懲教處等等，呢一群嘅執法者咧，當你係有一套好所謂完整嘅，即使係惡法嘅法律都好咧，佢覺得我做任何嘢都係只不過係跟住法律去做啫，咁樣係俾咗佢哋好心安理得嘅一個咁樣嘅狀態，令到佢係可以好願意去做一個政權嘅共謀咧，而個內心裏邊咧唔覺得內疚。咁呢個當然係同 Hannah Arendt 所講嘅所謂平庸的罪惡或者罪惡嘅平庸性係非常之相關，而呢個係好重要嘅。原來呢一個係好重要嘅，對於嗰啲所謂執法者嚟講咧，呢一種令到佢心安理得，我只係跟法律做啫，我跟上邊俾我一個指令去做啦，係其實係好重要，係令到嗰個政權咧係好順暢咁樣啦，係執行佢嘅權力嘅。而所以好多政權其實佢做首要嘅嘢咧，係要去穩定咩嘢咧？就係軍公教，即係話咧軍隊、政府嘅公務員甚至係教師等等，呢一啲係最核心嘅支持嘅隊伍咧。其實呢一套意識形態咧，最主要係提供俾佢哋。好啦，如果呢套咁嘅意識形態提供咗出嚟之後，以法治港之後咧，係令到嗰啲以往都係支持佢哋嘅一班親北京、親建制嘅人，佢可能講緊20-30% 嘅人嘅話咧，佢攞咗一套話語啦，係去到同嗰啲支持民主自由人去到辯駁，或者去到咧提供一套語言啦，去到咧係支持政府嘅話咧，咁呢個係 bonus 嚟㗎，係多出咗個政府所要嘅。但係最基本上面咧，佢係為咗呢一個最核心嘅統治隊伍係提供一套咧，係令到你團結同埋咧內心穩定嘅一套咁樣嘅意識形態。第二點我想提咧，就係最近香港嘅律政司司長咧，就林定國就提出啦，佢話點解我哋香港嘅法律咧喺國際嘅評分裏邊嚟講咧，其實並冇大跌嘅個分數。如果講 Rule of Law Index， 香港其實唔係話好似嗰啲新聞自由等等跌得咁犀利，但係點解喺人權嘅部分裏邊，我哋遭受咗咁多嘅批評咧？咁樣喺呢啲上面咧，我自己覺得需要補充就話香港係 慢慢從一個一國兩制變成咗一城兩制。呢個一城兩制喺法律上面嘅表現啦，我覺得我哋需要向好多唔清楚香港嘅聽眾講清楚嘅咧，就係話咧，其實有好多時候咧，大部分嘅案件，特別你話商業嘅案件或者一般嘅刑事嘅案件，佢唔涉及到國安或者政治咧，其實佢哋都係用緊普通法去到審理緊嘅，即係話普通法裏邊所有嘅其他有關 presumption of innocence 啊。或者你可以聘請你自己想要嘅律師啊，甚至係有法律援助啊，有一啲專業嘅法律嘅人士去到即係從事法律嘅工作，包括審訊啊等等，呢啲嘢其實係冇變嘅。咁即係話對於好大部分嘅商人啊，或者一般嘅市民嚟講，佢哋所經歷嘅法律體制嘅話咧，佢仍然好似原來嘅香港嘅法律體制。咁呢個嘅一城兩制咧，其實係造成咗喺一個整體嘅評分裏邊嚟講，香港嗰個法治冇大跌嘅。我覺得呢個必須都要向好多即係觀眾啊、聽眾啦去解釋嘅一個部分嚟嘅。嗱，而家我哋喺嗰啲評分裏邊跌得最犀利咧，主要就係講我哋係冇辦法用人權去用法律去保障人權，同埋我哋冇辦法用法律去制衡政府。嗱，呢兩個指標裏邊嚟講咧，係跌得好犀利嘅。咁，但係整體裏邊嚟講，有其他嘅指標係平衡咗佢嘅。咁所以，我覺得我哋呢一種已經慢慢由一國兩制走向咗一城兩制咧，其實嗰種欺騙性係好高嘅，係令到好大部分嘅人，甚至喺外邊嘅人睇呢啲大嘅數據嘅時，覺得咧香港嘅法律嘅體制並冇即係好大變，但係事實上邊咧，只要有啲人係面對不公義嘅情況咧，所有人都係會面對不公義，隨時下一個係輪到你噶嘛。好啦，咁第三點，我覺得Eric 提得好好咧，就係咧，佢而家唔係淨係一個國安法出嚟，係一個體制嚟嘅，係成個國安體制嚟嘅，包括咗個國安處等等。但我又想補充一點咧，其實我哋可以睇呢個國安體制咧，甚至係一個 industry 嚟，嗰個產業嚟嘅。因為喺中國裏邊嘅經驗咧，事實上邊咧，呢一套國安體制係涉及到好多嘅利益嘅。舉個例子喺中國裏邊嚟講咧。有啲地方裏邊咧，喺嗰啲教堂門口裝咗啲錄影機，咁有啲教友咧打爛咗錄影機又好嬲嘛，結果係冇事㗎，嗰啲國安係唔嬲嘅，點解咧？佢一定要你個教堂買翻個新嘅錄影機嗰陣時咧，係必須要佢指定嘅提供供應商裏邊去買嘅，而往往咧呢啲機係可以好貴嘅，而呢啲供應商往往同國安嘅呢啲嘅部門咧好多利益嘅糾纏相關嘅關係嚟嘅。咁我只係舉一個少少嘅例子咧，就話咧，其實佢亦都係一個產業嚟嘅，好多嘅人喺裏邊係獲得到利益嘅，所以佢係會自我延續咧。其實同個利益係有關嘅。咁最後尾個點，我覺得好好嘅咧，就係Eric 你提出咧，就係呢啲嘅法律嘅體制嘅出現咧，佢亦都產生咗一種心理上面嘅即係糾纏啊。咁你提到非常之好啊，呢種 shame 啊、guilt 啊、fear 啊等等咁樣。嗱，而佢我覺得其中一樣嘢好重要咧，佢係產生咗 distrust 同埋 withdrawal 呢兩樣嘢咧，其實係最係能夠破壞到公民社會嘅，因為其實每一個政權都係希望每一個公民咧都係出現一種所謂原子化嘅狀態 atomization。咁而當我哋係有 distrust，當我哋開始咩都唔想理，因為我唔想睇咁多咧，我又做唔到嘢咧，我會好多 guilt 噶嘛，咁你就會退出噶啦。咁呢個情況底下咧，令到我哋嘅公共生活咧係進一步受到破壞，而呢個係 fundamentally 咧係傷害緊我哋香港公民社會，係令到佢哋係即係喺好深層次裏邊咧係慢慢去崩潰嘅。所以我覺得 Eric 你提出嚟咗呢啲點係非常之重要嘅。好啦，第二個 presentation 係 Mandy 啦，我一路即係已經第二次聽 Mandy 做嘅 presentation， 我都覺得係做緊啲非常重要嘅研究同埋係好精彩。唔止係有系統啦，同埋我好多時候好中意睇見你引用好多嗰啲被訪者嘅語言啊，或者一啲好具體嘅事例啊，令到我哋明白好清楚咧嗰種嘅創傷點樣深刻法嘅。嗱，咁我覺得咧Mandy 嘅研究係好重要，就係咧好多個社會運動嘅研究咧都係集中咗喺動員期嘅，有關係資源啦 resources 啦，有關政治機會啦 political opportunities 啦呢啲係往往係而家研究社會運動裏邊好集中嘅。咁當然有啲新社會運動會包括係有關研究 framing 啦，成個運動裏邊用嘅語言啊、話語啊等等。但係咧，對於運動喺動員之後，所謂 post mobilization 咧， 其實嘅研究係非常之少嘅。啲人係會點樣去理解咗一場運動，特別係可能有挫折，可能失敗。咁究竟佢點樣去理解呢件事咧？點樣去 interpret 呢個運動裏邊嘅經驗咧？其實係好重要嘅。另外一樣嘢就係話，運動之後如果有創傷嘅話，呢種 aftercare 喺運動之後大家互相點樣去到支援咧？呢啲都係喺社會運動嘅呢個學科裏邊係非常之缺乏嘅。而我覺得咧，而家我哋不斷去提翻出呢啲 PTSD 咧，其實令大家留意翻究竟喺運動之後呢種創傷應該點樣處理，而呢樣嘢會唔會係提出一種生機出嚟，係令到運動可以持續落去咧？嗱，我哋而家成日講運動之後係啲咩狀態咧？而家有啲人就話運動如果失敗咪死咗咯咁樣，有啲人就話係 abeyance， 係一種暫時一種所謂整休期，喺度休息緊嘅啫咁樣。咁究竟係 abeyance 咧定係 death 咧？其實我哋冇咁快可以知道，而且好多時候係好決定於一個運動之後咧，究竟呢啲參與過運動嘅人佢點樣去到重新整合自己？如果佢識得做得更加好嘅話咧，佢可能呢個就 abeyance 有機會有第二輪嘅動員嘅。好啦，咁呢個啱啱我覺得Mandy 一開始嘅時候提到一個好重要一點就話咧，呢啲嘅創傷咧唔係淨係一啲個人嘅創傷，所以你都唔係就係話將個人創傷集合埋一齊。咁呢個就係我哋研究嘅對象，唔係嘅。呢個係一個 collective trauma， 呢個係一個 social trauma。咁呢個係一個社會過程而造成嘅。咁呢個提示我哋點樣咧？當我哋做 therapies 去到治療呢啲咁樣嘅創傷時，個過程係咪都係應該用個 social process 嘅？而唔係純粹就係單對單咁樣去尋求一啲所謂專業上邊嘅 therapy 或者治療。咁喺呢個角度睇咧，即係話咧，如果我哋有一個群體係參與，特別係參與過運動人嘅呢個參與者嘅群體，佢哋如果明白呢啲概念，佢哋如果亦都係受過相當嘅某啲嘅訓練，特別對某啲嘅 enabler， 其中喺呢啲參與運動者裏邊，佢對呢啲問題特別敏感嘅，特別有能力去學習點樣去到幫助其他受創傷嘅人嘅話咧，咁呢一個嘅社會過程就可以發生啦。嗱，喺呢點上邊嚟講，我自己個人咧而家提出一個概念咧，就係受苦嘅共同體 （community of suffering）。咁我呢個其實係講緊咩咧？個核心嘅部分咧就係嗰啲被捕嘅3000幾人，佢哋有好多最撚尾係會坐監嘅。佢哋嘅屋企人同埋佢哋一樣咧，係受咗好多創傷嘅。喺等待審訊以至審訊以至坐監咧，佢同埋屋企人都好多傷害嘅。好啦，但係喺周邊裏邊有一個群體咧，其實係不斷喺度想支援佢哋嘅，寫信啊、探監啊、旁聽啊等等。咁呢度係有第二個圈，咁第二個第三個圈出現咧。第三個圈就係佢哋嗰種所謂 mutual support， 就係嗰啲咧支持者唔係再支持嗰啲所謂政治犯咧，而佢哋自己互相去到支持。嗱，我覺得呢三層咧，其實形成咗一個好重要嘅一個所謂受苦嘅共同體嘅。如果佢哋能夠好好地去到產生呢一種互相幫助，咁我就會翻到好似你舉嘅例子，你啱啱舉就係 Jeffrey Alexander 講 cultural trauma。佢講 cultural trauma 嗰時就話咧，呢個其實甚至最撚尾影響咗人嘅 identity 嘅。咁我覺得如果通過一個痛苦嘅 trauma 嘅過程，如果能夠有 mutual assistance， 最嬲尾其實可以產生出一個 community， 一個共同體。呢個共同體令到佢哋可以分享咧相同嘅乜嘢咧價值觀，因為大家有同理心，我知道點解你會受苦，我亦都會好嬲你咁樣受苦，個政權點樣不義，我同你有相同嘅感覺，我哋可能會分享共同嘅價值觀 shape values。我哋最嬲尾如果喺呢個互相支持裏邊覺得我哋係一個兄弟手足嘅話，我哋係會 share similar identities。最嬲尾我哋其實係有共同嘅命運，因為大家可能一齊向前望。咁所以其實咧呢一個 trauma 本身係一個 opportunities 嚟嘅，喺呢個 opportunities 去創造一個 community with similar values, identity and faith。咁而家問題就係話我哋能唔能夠轉化得到？係咪能夠 create 到一種即係一個社群一個 community 係懂得點樣去做呢種即係 mutual support？ 我哋而家見到有啲嘢會出現緊嚇，即係話我哋見到有啲家長繼續喺度扶持嗰啲離散出嚟嘅啲年青人嚇啲手足啊，我哋見到留低嘅喺香港裏邊，佢哋呢啲探監師啊、旁聽師其實係成日都見面嘅，佢哋有啲形成一個群體。 咁我哋一齊會去某啲，即係大家會喺書店會碰到啊，或者啲黃店會碰到啊，呢啲都係好重要嘅一啲嘅社群嘅活動。咁點樣係令到深化？特別我啱啱講啦，就係有冇啲 enabler，佢特別喺呢啲人嘅中間裏邊，佢懂得點樣去提供一種協助。因為我相信呢啲經歷過政治 trauma 嘅人咧，佢唔係入到一個治療室對住一個 clinical psychologist 對佢嚟講最大幫助，而係啲大家經歷過相同經驗、有同情共感人，但係有啲人有特別嘅一啲嘅 professional skill 咧，係可以做一個 facilitator 咧，係最能夠喺嗰個羣體裏邊去幫助得到佢哋。咁呢一個就係我所講嘅一個即係 community of suffering 啦。咁呢個就係我嘅補充。I'm sorry, Camilo. I know that you don't know Cantonese, but I'm sure we have found some people now here, and some of them, I guess, many of them, in fact, know Cantonese. So that's why I wanted to leave my commentary in Cantonese. But I'm done now. I guess I used up almost 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Professor Kinman, thank you so much for providing these comments in Cantonese. Absolutely fine, and I hope I will learn Cantonese soon to have some conversations with you in the future. I don't know, Mandy, Eric, would you like to do any comments to the discussions? Maybe some few comments before passing the floor to our I don't know, well, to the people who are seeing this conversation. I just for the record, I have already 6 questions, 5 collected by our social channels, 1 by the chat. So if anybody who is in the call here want to do any kind of questions, please feel free to write in the chat or just raise the hands like Iverson did. So Mandy, Eric, 5 minutes, 3 seconds, any reactions?
Eric goes first.
Thank you so much, Kim-Man, for your great comments. And as there are many friends here trying to chat with us, I look forward to the Q&A.
Okay, I would like to respond to Kim-Man's Cantonese commentary. I think just very quickly, just to maybe recap for the international audience, well, one of the key messages that I took from Kim-Man's very helpful commentary was about this kind of community of suffering, this idea that Kim-Man has kind of propagated over the last year or so, if I understood correctly, and really talking about the importance of mutual support and peer support, and how basically taking the idea from, because I was earlier mentioning how authoritarian trauma as an oppression-based social trauma is not just, relevant to the individual. So Kim-Man's idea was about maybe like how we can think about or create new ways of supporting individuals who are, how can I say that, who are at, maybe suffering in whatever way that they are due to repression, beyond just one-on-one consultations with a therapist, and maybe having some sort of community supports. And I completely agree and second what Kim-Man has been saying. In fact, the second part of my presentation, as part of these dialogue session, I will focus on social resilience. So I will actually elaborate on some of that later on, and also looking at examples from other communities, like and how they have also maybe responded to trauma, within their own context. Because what has happened to Hong Kong, we are not the only ones who have been suffering from this kind of repression. We can learn a lot from other societies and other communities. But the other point that Kim-Man raised was I very much thank him for, was about the importance of looking at, in terms of social movement scholarship, looking at what happens after the movement, or maybe when movement is in abeyance. So this was the reason why I think a similar lacuna is actually happening in trauma studies, in the sense that, a lot of trauma studies have focused on one big key event, maybe 9/11, maybe, let's say the Nanjing massacre. The way they focus on really, how can I say that, cataclysmic events, but then don't talk about the kind of the more quotidian kind of trauma that happens after you have events that make headline news. So that's really what my research is looking at. It's looking at the kind of ordinary microaggressions that we are suffering in Hong Kong that makes no international headline news. And that, to be honest, that has also been what I drew from the Palestinian experience as well. Because when we learn about Palestine, it was when they are suffering humongous harms in terms of genocide and actual wars of aggression. But a lot of times they are living in what is called an open air prison, and they are suffering trauma on a daily basis. And I'm actually seeing a lot of what has happened to Hong Kong. We are kind of going down similar trajectories in terms of a lot of the daily repression that we are experiencing as a people is not making headlines. So let's say we don't know what happened, like, if something drastic happens and then we finally make headlines, and that is basically a reaction to something that has been going on for years that nobody noticed. And this is why I'm interested in doing what we're looking at. Trauma is not just one big event. It really is ongoing, and it could be microaggressions as well. So thank you. That's my response.
Thank you, Mandy. Before going to the break, I'm going to give the floor really quick to Iverson, who has a question, and after that, I will do the break. Welcome back, everyone, for this second part. And once again, thank you for the people who are following us on all our social media channels. I'm really happy to report that 671 people are connected already to the call. So this is really good. And of course, the people who are here. So we're going to do in the next second part of the global conversation is that we're going to have two other presentations again. We're going to have a presentation by Mandy, who is going to address how social resilience and resistance have been seen as expressions through communal meaning making under conditions of ongoing repression. And of course, she's going to address the case of Hong Kong. And after her presentation, Eric is going to give us his reflections regarding legal resistance and, of course, how to address Hong Kong and international perspectives as well. So, Mandy, thank you once again for being here in this second part. And you will have 20 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Camilo. And please do give me the 5-minute and 1-minute warning as well later on. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to everyone for staying with us over this period. And I will, without further ado, I just share my screen. Just hold on 1 second. Oh, actually, no, I shared the wrong thing. Sorry. So what did I do? I should be doing this. Sorry, can you're looking at my screen.
Yeah, we're seeing your calendar, and now.
Oh, okay, sorry. Maybe I should stop sharing. Sorry. Sorry, I click on the wrong thing. So let me try again. I should be using screen. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but it somehow is not. Is this no, sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah, sorry, let me just do this properly so that I don't get. Okay, and then I'm going to share screen, and then I'm going to. Oh yes, so then now you should see the correct presentation.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Oh, why? What happened? Sorry, I have so many files open. Okay, so I need to. How do I? Sorry, slideshow. From current slide. Okay, you can see everything. Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
thank you so much. I apologize for the slight hiccup tech wise. Okay, so we were following from before the break a discussion about authoritarian legality from Eric and also authoritarian trauma from myself. And we want to move on from kind of ideas about kind of the repression that Hong Kongers have been suffering, and then the trauma that we have been suffering as a community, to look at resilient and resistant practices, I guess. And I suppose I want to kind of hark back to a very famous author that are also familiar with Hong Kongers, and I'm sure a lot of our international audiences as well, Václav Havel, who wrote about the power of the powerless. And he wrote about how the post in his essay on the power of the powerless, there are many gems, but I want to pick a few extremely relevant quotes. He talked about the post-totalitarian system demands conformity, uniformity, and discipline. So it is interesting to look at when we talk about earlier before the break about how repression is not just coming from the state actors, but also from non-state actors. It also could be coming from proxies in the community as well. How do we, how can I say that as members of a repressed community, how do we respond? How do we react and how do we respond to it? And so so it's interesting to see, first of all, in terms of repression, what are they demanding from us in terms of the powerless people? Are they demanding conformity, uniformity, and disciplines? And then he went on to say that because the regime is captive to its own lies, it must falsify everything. It falsifies the past, it falsifies the present, and it falsifies the future. It falsifies statistics as well. And I think a very recent example of that is, in fact, well, actually, in the context of China, how they are not naming the unemployed anymore. They are reframing. Instead of calling the unemployed, they're using the word flexibly employed instead of unemployed. And then in the Hong Kong context, very recently, an example of that is where the regime decides to not define what poverty is. So then, like, there's no proper definition of poverty. So then, I suppose if we don't have a proper definition of poverty, then we don't know how many people actually have come under economic hardship in recent times. So it's this idea of, how can I say, things being blamed, reality being mislabeled and misrepresented. But the thing is, they're doing it really forthrightly. It pretends to pretend nothing. So as individuals living within that system, we have to live with their lie. And for that very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. So I think this is an interesting quote to remember, is that yes, we are under repression, but actually through our own individual action or non-action, as it might be, we could also be agents of either change or something for the better, or we could just be agents of systemic repression against our other fellow Hong Konger members. And then obviously then it comes with his very famous quote, if the main pillar of the system is living a lie, then it is not surprising that the fundamental threat is living the truth, which in Hong Kong has been translated as 活得磊落真誠. And I know that Professor Chan Ki-man has a lovely, beautiful kind of calligraphy of that quote that has been, how can I say that? I also actually have a copy of in my home. You can get it from independent bookstores. The idea is that in the widest possible sense of the word, be understood as opposition in the post-totalitarian system is living within the truth. So how do we do that, or do we even do that? And what has that got to do with social resilience? So this is where I want to quote from Viktor Frankl, which is a very famous Austrian psychiatrist who wrote the bestseller about logotherapy. The Man's Search for Meaning. That's a very famous book, which I'm sure a lot of our audience members would know about. Now, there's a quote that has been attributed to him, but it's not exactly his words, but it is very much encapsulating a lot of what he had been saying. This idea of between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies both our growth and our freedom. And this is what I want to say about responses versus reactions, because when we are undergoing trauma, it elicited a lot of stress symptoms, as I mentioned about kind of clinical studies that looked at how we manifest maybe depressive or stress disorder symptoms in being traumatized at an individual level. But we can also choose, like, those are, I suppose, physiological reactions, but we can also choose responses deliberately. There's always that space to choose. And the key thing is that when we respond, in addition to just reacting to what is happening to us, that response is both growth and freedom. And this is the reason why what I'm exploring in this stage of my research is this connection between resilience and resistance. Growth is very much in relation to our mental health capacity, but when it also when our freedom is also dependent on it, then it became also a resistance action. And just a very brief overview of the resilience literature, because like it is completely vast and it's completely multidisciplinary. You can talk about systems resilience in terms of financial systems and economic systems as well. And in fact, like, because I'm based in the Centre for Health Policy and Management in Trinity College Dublin, my colleagues, the former head of our centre, he is very famous for his work about the resilience in terms of the health system against financial shocks. So like you can talk about resilience, in a very, very broad and diversifying ways according to different disciplines and according to different levels of analysis and according to different aspects of it. I think that in relation to our present discussion, I want to talk about there's two in terms of resilience, the kind of mental health related resilience, both at the individual, at the communal level. We need to think about how resilience literature has kind of shifted over the course of time as well. So just as what I have explained earlier about trauma studies also moving away from an event-based model of trauma, resilience literature has also changed over time in terms of how we conceptualize resilience. So this is where我可以講一啲廣東話，I'm going to use some Cantonese words here, because the Cantonese phrase for resilience, resilience 有陣時會係translate as 復原，有陣時可以translate 係復原或者係韌性。So those are maybe the two key ways of the way resilience has been translated into Cantonese. 咁復原呢一個字咧is also very keen to the recovery model of resilience. So recovery model is very much the idea that, okay, you suffered an adverse episode. Whatever is the adversity that you have encountered, and then you are trying to move on from it, in trying to regain equilibrium and return to a state of health. So kind of return to baseline. This idea that 我哋真係要復原返，咁我哋係譬如話我哋經過咗一個好大嘅 traumatic episode，可能話我哋係或者經過2019嗰個好大嗰個社會嗰個運動嗰個 crackdown，咁我哋要療傷，我哋要 move on from it，我哋想去返我哋以前嗰種the state of maybe societal mental health that we had. So that was maybe the idea of 復原。But that kind of model of resilience has also really been critiqued very much since then over the last decade or so. 因為其實so this is again I'm trying to speak in Cantonese. It is, first of all, we already critique the fact that you don't have this one big single episode of adversity, because we talk about trauma being ongoing, right? So you cannot really talk about post-traumatic growth, because post-traumatic growth is very much about, okay, you already moved on from it, you are already removed from that environment that has harmed you, and you are now in a space where you can nurture yourself into maybe better health and well-being. But a lot of times that is not possible for a lot of people. And the key thing is that a lot of time, not only the trauma is ongoing, but also that how can I say that we cannot return to baseline, because 用一個廣東話，我哋返唔到去，我哋係回不去。So there's a lot of times people are nostalgic for the past, generally what happened in the years before, when we had better institutions, when we had freedom of speech under the British colonial rule. We had better protected or how can I say that freedoms, etc., etc. But history being what it is, especially when you talk about communal trauma, it is not possible to always say return to an earlier stage. So what do we do when we cannot so-called recover to return to a previous state of health, to return to baseline? So then there is this second idea about sustainability, whereby the idea is that instead of continuing on the recovery, instead of returning to a baseline state of health, we are talking about maybe how can I say, how we can transform it. 轉化咗頭先KM 都有講過轉化呢個字。How can we transform it that we can allow for growth and even enhancement of function as a result of healthy reactions to stressful experience? And then the other idea about resilience literature is also from post-colonial authors as well. because a lot of times, we are having to live with, the oppression. So, so for example, a lot of the Black authors in America and also a lot of other post-colonial authors as well have talked about that, when we talk about our trauma, in articulating it, our response is not only malaise and melancholia, and that has connotations to submissiveness and inaction as the inevitable outcome of traumatization. 即係我哋雖然我哋係 experience 緊創傷，但係我哋唔係真係創傷，淨係有創傷嘅 negative symptoms. We can also maybe in some way, how can it transform it into some sort of some sort of resilience, some sort of strength. So so what kind of transformative change might be possible? So the idea is that instead of returning to pre-trauma functionality, we talk about how we can transform it in a way that would be conducive to both individual and communal health. So this is the reason why we talk about resilience as a sociological concept. And what do we mean by social resilience as dynamic, communal, and political? Dynamic in the sense that, it is not a kind of just a before and after. It could be you are in a trajectory, you can have ups and downs, how can I say, the highs and lows. And it's not just about you yourself dealing with it yourself, especially when we're talking about oppression-based trauma and collective trauma, is how we as a community, how do we respond to it? And it's also political. And that is the bit that I am a little bit unsure of, and I would like to have people's responses and thoughts. Because precisely, how can I say, I think it was Eric who mentioned that another sociologist from Hong Kong already talked about 16 different ways in which soft resistance can occur, and I'm trying to, how can I say, I have to be very careful in how I talk about my research in a way that I don't want to criminalize, how can I say, normal everyday communal activities that may be then seen by the regime as, oh my God, that is soft resistance. And then that will be allowed as a basis for persecution of community members. So I have to be very careful. But I want to say, how can I say that, examples of how, yes, it is dynamic, communal. Yes, the idea is that we no longer require adversity to be defined as a singular event, nor for resilience to be only examined at the level of the individual. And that basically, it opens up, how can I say, possibilities to explore the creative and the political rather than the pathological and negative, as has been very much deplored in trauma studies. So yeah, so there have been some other relatively recent studies that have emerged in the last 10 years or so, decade or so, researchers investigating post-traumatic growth and adaptive responses after adverse communal phenomena, for example, after disasters, whether it was after a terrorist attack or after, let's say, an environmental disaster like hurricane, etc. But this is, I want to find out, instead of just looking at the post-disaster communal responses, can we talk about communal responses that we are co-constructing while living with the oppression? Sorry. And then, okay. So this is, again, I'm using another classic author in this case for inspiration. And this is Rollo May, who is an American existential psychologist. He talked about the gap between self and the world, which is a bit similar to what Viktor Frankl talked about, the space between stimulus and response. But he talked about how we are able to use symbols to reason and to speak in language, and that mental health is the capacity to be aware of the gap that we can choose between stimulus and response, together with the capacity to use this gap constructively. So how can we use this gap constructively? So this is where I think, again, this is why my research is sociology. This is why we're doing this session under ISA. I really want to focus on communal co-construction. So my research is sociological research, not psychological research. This is not a clinical therapeutic research. I'm not looking at evaluations of individual communal interventions. I want to focus on how we as Hong Kongers talk to and express ourselves to each other in public. Now, obviously, we talk to our friends and families, etc., in private as well. But I want to see in terms of our public discourses, how we talk to each other. And I want to emphasize another point here, which is that a lot of times, especially in the Hong Kong context, whenever we talk about 創傷啊、復原呢啲嘢咧, whenever we talk about trauma and resilience, that kind of thing, people tend to jump immediately into the idea that 我哋係賣緊慘啊。即係我係好想講清楚 the key difference between what I'm trying to explore and what supposedly happens in other ways is 我唔係想講我哋點樣去將我哋香港人嘅 story 話俾其他人聽。That is a secondary purpose, I guess. 我唔係想講我哋香港點樣慘，跟住我哋要去人哋度買慘，咁所以人哋就可以 take pity on us and then I don't know have solidarity or whatever. That's not what my goal is. All the goal is, as you should hopefully see later on in this passage, is 我哋要 acknowledge 創傷係 for 我哋 first and foremost, for us, how we talk to each other, for that acknowledgement among our community first and foremost, 係我哋點樣同我哋自己人傾偈，而唔係話我哋點樣將我哋嘅創傷表達俾其他人睇。So I think that is a key thing I want to make sure that everyone get it from the very get go. So this is the reason
Mandy,
why.
Sorry, you have 5 minutes.
Oh my goodness! So I have almost no time. Okay, so well, I'll go very quickly. So I have different narrative practices that I have identified as resilient responses to repression, between foul language, sarcasm, and pointed silence, and I presented it in different kind of arenas. 咁所以其實I will go to some of these examples really quickly and then I want to look at some international examples as well. First of all 係用廣東話粗口係做一個 communal response. 咁this one is we really fucking love Hong Kong 啦，我哋真係好撚鍾意香港。咁 this was something that immediately appeared as a slogan after the imposition of the national security law. Literally, it was 30th of June, midnight or something, when the law came into effect. And then literally the very next day, as part of the July 1st protests, people were already bringing out this banner. So they're deliberately not talking about kind of protest demands, etc. They just simply express our love. We fucking love Hong Kong, essentially. So how can you criminalize us by simply expressing our radical love for our community, for our city? And there's also other ones in more recent times. This is again from the Hong Kong fire. From last year, essentially. There was one about the Hong Kong fire where there was this screen cap of how the chief executive of Hong Kong interacted with a fire person, and then the meme in terms of the actual language was 你講乜撚嘢屌你老母 which means what the fuck are you talking about, your motherfucker. So like that's the translation of it. Yeah, I should have a trigger warning for any foul language people who might be triggered by foul language. I'm so sorry. And then this other one is where an example of because of the fact that Hong Kongers have been disenfranchised from the electoral process in Hong Kong, so then there has been a number of sham elections that had taken place, and essentially this meme basically talk about, okay, you go and elect, you do whatever you like for your elections, but do not fucking bother me, essentially. So this is about like, the person basically saying no to all sort of election propaganda, family visits, leaflets, 唔撚該, that's like, fucking thank you or something. That's the way. Okay, so you might think, why do I focus on bad language? Like, I mean, the content of these things on its own, you may think, oh, that, that's already, a very radical refusal of state narratives, let's say. But there's a reason why bad language is helpful from a health perspective. So I would encourage everyone, I'm sure people who are already into trauma studies will have heard of Dr. Gabor Mate, who is a Canadian physician, an expert on trauma and addiction. And he had written many, many books. And there was one book he taught, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture, where he talked about the importance of using bad language as well. So there was a particular incident that he recorded in his interaction with a patient who used the F word, and and basically he encouraging his patient, saying that the use of the F word probably have extended the patient's life. There's also another book he wrote back in 2003, When the Body Says No, The Cause of Hidden Stress. So basically the idea that health is just not a matter of thinking happy thoughts. We could be angered. There's a burst of long suppressed anger. Anger, or the healthy experience of it, is one of the 7 A's of healing. So our bad language is a way for us to safely and communally process this anger, in a way. And you may not think of it, like, 講粗口好似, like, saying bad words is like, it's only a emotional burst. It means nothing. And it may just, pollute the social environment or wherever it is. But the key thing is that if you are if you're angered by systemic injustices, where you have no personal control, and then your reaction, if you want to use that language, is to respond, in how can I say it, expressing your anger in foul language is absolutely a healthy response in that case. And then, so I can go on, but the other kind of narrative practices is also about satire and sarcasm as narrative practice to resist oppression. Another example of that in the international context of the bad language is about, like, how Ukrainians would say "fuck Russia," as part of their slogans. Again, is what is common across cultures, not only in Hong Kong or elsewhere. Then the idea of sarcasm and satire as narrative practice to resist oppression, produced through networks of meaning. And this is the reason why we're talking about, this is not just about us talking to individual therapists or us just kind of writing out our own kind of thoughts on how we're experiencing, which could also be important and helpful. But the idea is that this is how we express our dismay and our dissent in community with each other, and how we can understand each other because we are insiders of a communal group. So satire especially is a very important idea, an important example of that networks of meaning. Actually this quote is coming from Yang and Jiang, who actually were writing in the Chinese context in terms of the type of sarcasm that Chinese netizens use to express their displeasure with their totalitarian regime. But the key thing here is that about satire sarcasm is that the producer intends to mean the opposite of what the message is would normally mean. So they are reverse discourses, and it is seen as anti-racist resistance. So this is again drawing ideas from other types of struggles, where it is not just about regime oppression, but also other forms of oppression. So then I suppose an example that is very familiar to different Hong Kongers is this idea of this quote, 由治及興，咁係因為你悲觀啫，我就睇到由治及興嘅好處。That is just your own pessimism. I myself can clearly see the benefits of moving from stability to prosperity. So it has become an internet meme in Hong Kong. But the phrase came from Xi Jinping himself. This was an Economist article where they examined whether Xi Jinping can take Hong Kong from stability to prosperity. So literally it was an official slogan that was being used. And then the actual longer quote about, that was just your own pessimism. I myself can clearly see the benefits from stability to prosperity. That's from a forum in Hong Kong, an internet forum in Hong Kong. And then there has been lots of different variations of it, like in terms of memes. You can see this kind of Rudy and Buzz Lightyear version of it. You can see this kind of ophthalmologist version of it, etc. The reason why it's not just the existence of this meme per se, but what they use it to respond to. So this is the reason why you can see that it's very much censored. But I had a discussion with Eric last night about whether to what extent we can use original quotes. And then I thought maybe I can use English expressions. But then I thought, okay, a lot of these Hong Kongers using our words, and this is meant to be Cantonese as well. So maybe I try to how can I say, anonymize it to extent that I hope that they may not be. Yeah, and in any case, yes, I would see what happens. How can I say? I take responsibility for using some of these original quotes, but I really want to show how we use that quote to respond to situations in Hong Kong that are causes of communal trauma. So this one is whereby the person is using that quote to respond to statistics about school children suicides in Hong Kong. So there has been a spike in suicide rates in Hong Kong in recent years, especially particularly harrowing is the issue of school children suicides. This person say every few days we hear another case of school child suicide. And basically the person said, I'm so optimistic. I'm really beginning to see the benefit of from stability to prosperity. And then there's another quote from another person where the person said, oh, I just woke up and then I discovered that more people can enjoy. I just woke up and I realized that a few more friends no longer able to enjoy the benefits of from stability to prosperity. I feel so sorry for them. And that basically is the news of after hearing more people who have been targeted by the national security law and being arrested. There's
Sorry,
also
Mandy, you have 1 minute. I'm sorry.
okay. I have only 1 minute. Another example is where Hong Kongers responding to the economic situation in Hong Kong. This is about the Hang Seng Index, what it was in 2019 versus what it is now, and then basically saying don't be pessimistic. This is another benefit of from stability to prosperity, and then also people reacting to the closure of local businesses and restaurants, etc. Saying, oh, I'm so. I basically using the regime slogan to highlight, they are really missing out on, how can I say that, this idea of from stability to prosperity. So I realized that I'm very little time, but the key idea is that narrative power stems from complexity and indeed is ambiguity. And this is also why this is resilient, because how can I say? I mentioned already that anger is a healthy experience and one of the key factors of healing. Sorry, I have to skip through all that because I want to get into the key bit. Is that a lot of times our sarcasm and also our pointed silence, which I didn't get a chance to get into, is to say that these are emerging in social spaces defined by dominance and oppression and concealed from outsiders as acts of resistance and cultural preservation. So because we are undergoing ongoing repression, so we have to be very careful and very tacit in how we communicate to each other. Again, that is kind of also mentioning James C. Scott's infrapolitics. Basically that our struggle is waged daily, like infrared rays beyond the visible end of the spectrum, and that so from a health perspective, and this is kind of coming from Bessel van der Kolk, who is another trauma specialist, the idea is that the critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know, and that takes enormous amount of courage. So it's not about only allowing ourselves individually to know what we know, it's also allowing our community members to know what we also know. So this is a very micro level of social resilience, is to say that using our own language and our own cultural heritage, how can we share with each other that we are in common suffering? How do we acknowledge common suffering among ourselves? So that is really the key issue here. And I know I didn't get a chance to really talk about this, but the idea is that I go from, how can I say that, in terms of narrative practices, people can go from, let's say, maybe more open narrative confrontation in terms of using foul language to using less open, more ambiguous responses, using maybe sarcastic responses, satire, etc., to being pointed silent, to using pointed silence, whereby we are completely silenced, but we're still pointing out that we have been not able to say anything. But then it shows that this range of narrative practices is showing that we are increasingly having very limited space for communal narratives. There are also other international struggles in terms of other ways in which we can talk about communal healing practices, which I don't have time to cover. There are also symbolic icon of struggles. I'm from Ireland, so I'm from Ireland and Hong Kong, and this is Sinead O'Connor, who basically tear a picture of the Pope at a music performance in 1992, and how can I say, we're not saying everyone has to be very brave and defiant and be a symbolic icon for our struggles. But the idea was why we still need to actually understand the fact that we are suffering communally is because we want to be able to show that some of us are still trying. So in terms of concluding thoughts, trauma can be understood as an experience of being made into an object. So then our communal narrative practices help us to restore voice, subjectivity, and agency, not only as feeling individuals, but feeling as a community. So yeah, so communal healing, meaning making is both resilience and resistance is basically my take-home message. And I will stop sharing my screen now. I'm so sorry for the overrunning. Sorry about this.
Thank you, Mandy, for this is really, really interesting presentation. And I'm just going to pass the floor to Eric for his final presentation regarding legal resistance, Hong Kong, and international perspectives. And hopefully we'll have some minutes for some questions. So Eric, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Camilo, and thank you, Mandy, for the presentations. And Camilo, may I just clarify, because in our advertisement we are ending in 18 minutes. So I just want to clarify: will we still have the Q&A sessions after 8:30 Taipei time?
Yeah, that's going to be like the challenge. Maybe I will collect the questions and send to you. We will find a way to collect the questions and provide some answers. But yeah, because we are running out of time, unfortunately, so we'll find a way. But sorry for that, Eric.
No problem. Yeah, thank you, and thank you for all keeping staying with us. And let me share my screen for now. And thanks so much again, Mandy, for your presentations on resilience and resistance. And you also moved me to try to slightly change my presentation title with Legal Resistance and Resilience, Hong Kong and International Perspectives, because what Mandy shared also made me recall my previous learnings in theological studies and religious studies on resilience. And for me, I have a slightly different translation of resilience in Cantonese. That is "con nhiệt lực." Is literally mean the capacity, the capability to resist or to contend difficulties or adverse situations. And 抗逆力以中文嘅意思可以係話係抵抗或者係對抗一個逆境嘅能力嚇。咁In some definitions, resilience can be defined as overcoming adversity, bouncing back from challenges, or thriving despite experiencing setbacks in life. So in some sense, of course, resilience is related to a trauma, and it could be a solution to trauma. But at the same time, resilience can be more than trauma focused. And it must be trauma informed, but it can be more than trauma, because what is also about improvisation or creativity of individuals and collectives. That how do they overcome adverse circumstances and how to face the challenging conditions. And I guess it relates to the issues of legal resistance and resilience, because in autocratic settings, courtrooms, the legal system, the criminal justice systems are the challenging conditions, are the repressive conditions or architecture that people are finding ways to thrive, not just to heal themselves, but also find ways to thrive themselves. And as you also quote, it's also called man searching for meaning. I guess he is exactly suffering from imprisonment, suffering from the concentration camps. And I guess how do individuals, how do collectives overcome and resist these unfavorable setups that bound them and contain them, and would be a way for us to explore what does resilience mean or resistance mean nowadays. And I've shared the screen. I assume everyone can read it. And some scholarly literature on studies of authoritarianism and law, or legal activism under authoritarianism. Some scholars identified 4 general strategies or tactics for activist lawyers, or in academic terms we call course lawyers, which is very outstanding. There's a lot of outstanding literature in Anglo-American legal studies. And what are the ways for legal actors, especially lawyers, not just lawyers, it could be other individuals, to continue legal activism in challenging conditions? And scholars have identified at least 4 strategies. One, course lawyering in the form of proceduralism or individual protection. So in the past, or in democratic settings, very convenient for lawyers, for legal counsel to defend their clients in the name of protection of substantive rights, like rights to free speech, rights to associations. But in an autocratic setting, when substantive rights are deprived or are undermined because, for example, in the name of safeguarding national security or counterterrorism, then lawyers must find another way to protect their clients and broadly protect the legal system. And seeking due process, focusing on defending procedural justice is a way for them to find way to not just to survive, but to thrive and to protect the integrity of the legal system and their client as a whole. And secondly, it's still important for activist lawyers or legal activists to engage in massive or tiny scale political activities or political mobilization in the name of defending professional autonomy or an independent judiciary, because these are the terminologies that even authoritarian regimes would adopt to justify, to legitimize their practices in laws and statutes, and the instrumentalization of the judiciary to achieve their own ends. So highlighting these terminologies in parallel and in response to the state agenda, the state propaganda, is something potentially workable in authoritarian settings. Thirdly, it is to leverage transnational human rights network in the sense that in autocratic setting, people could not simply rely on their own. And as we observe, the use of the national security laws in Hong Kong are becoming more expansive in extraterritorial settings. We can see the regime is also afraid, or also scared of international solidarity or transnational network building among local civil society with overseas communities. And fourthly, activist lawyers will still engage in designing constitutional and political reform in transitional regimes, and this is more particularly it's more particular on regimes undergoing political transitions or transitional justice. It may not be fully manifested in many existing or stabilized authoritarian or hybrid regimes, but engaging in policy formulations, legislative formulation is also a way to remain active in the public domain, especially when autocratic regimes are still eager to present or to hold a facade that they are open to consultations, they remain consultative and being open to listen to different voices. And another key ideas that I would like to address here and share here is the interrelationships between developing legal institutions and developing legal culture. And I guess this is how resistance and resilience uphold here, because for many studies of the rule of law or on comparative law or on legal science, many of them are mainly focusing on the legal institutions or legal architecture, say how the justice system work, how the court verdict, how can we understand and study and analyze the court verdict, court adjudication, or the institutional setups, whether they are compliant with universal principles. But what's more importantly, what's equally important is how do we ensure the institutions are supporting and enabling legal norms or legal cultures in a popular and in a professional setting that people will believe and will trust legal system, legal institutions and judges. They are respecting human rights values. They are respecting freedoms in rule of law and professional autonomy. So, with a strong legal culture, with a strong public attitude towards towards a liberal conception of rule of law, could in the end or in the long run impact the practices of legal institutions. And on the other hand, if a legal institution is very autocratic and their values embedded in the system, whatever in the substantive legal principles or in the procedural practices, they will also impact the general attitude and the professional attitude towards the role and the significance of laws, courts, and statutes. So in this sense, if we understand these mutual constitutive elements between legal institutions and legal culture, I guess one of the observations or one of the discovery for legal resistance is that even though the legal institutions, the legal architecture may not be favorable to liberal democratic ideals or to human rights ideals, nurturing, sustaining, and enabling a rights-based legal culture, a liberal legal culture in civil society, in the general public, and eventually even to the professional industries would be essential to resist the autocratization or authoritarian legality in the long run, or in a sustainable way. And here I would like to quote some examples of how this upholding a legal culture or alternative non-autocratic legal culture is essential, and who can do that, and in what space, in what occasions can it be realized. One of the key struggles or key political contestation in autocratic regime is in the courtroom. When the government, when the authorities are prosecuting political opponents through criminal laws and taking them to the criminal trials, and we have witnessed a lot, and not just in Hong Kong, right? In other authoritarian regimes in Russia, China, Belarus, you name it. And all these politically driven criminal trials, or let me make it simple, political trials are essential, not just because it demonstrates how the authorities try to manipulate the courtroom, try to manipulate the legal system to achieve their political ends, that is to suppress their opponents, their enemies. But at the same time, it can also in some cases it can also demonstrate the resilience of the defendants, the criminal defendants, in responding or resisting the authorities' practices in the courtroom. And what are the practices in the courtroom? I guess most of the study are merely focusing on judicial outcomes, like whether the court will acquit someone, whether the court will convict someone. But more importantly, it is, in my humble view, it's more important on the process. How the prosecution, how the judges, how the defendants interacted, and how the defendants respond to not just to the evidence proposed by the prosecution, but also the narratives, the discourse proposed or highlighted by the political authorities. And in this case, South Africa, as everyone knows, Nelson Mandela, he has been multiply charged and convicted and jailed in 1950s and 60s. And one of the most outstanding trial was Reformia trial that he and his former colleagues were charged with sabotage because of his military resistance during the apartheid times. And in the trials, it has become a very internationally recognized. It's become a very popular trial, not just because of the outcome. The outcome was very, very cruel. All of them have been imposed life sentencing. But during the process, during the course of hearings, Mandela's speeches, he tried to highlight the importance of struggle for rights, try to disentrench the myths of white people having the ownership, having the supremacy on the lands of South Africa, and explaining his vision on a common good, on the equality of everyone is very essential to move not just to the people in the courtroom, but to the people outside the courtroom. And outside of the courtroom, there are still people showing solidarity actions, trying to dance, to sing in support of Mandela and his colleagues. And these are examples of how people became creative and improvise when they are facing very difficult, very challenging judicial settings that would put their colleagues, put their peers into life imprisonment. And if I may spend some time to quote how Mandela turned his testimonies into an important political speech, and what are the insights that we can find here. If I may quote from his speech in this Reformia trial, that he said, "In my youth, in the Transkei, I listened to the elders of my tribe telling stories of the old days. Amongst the tales they related to me were those of wars fought by our ancestors in defense of our fatherland." And if I may quote further, "I hope that life may offer me the opportunity to serve my people and make my own humble contribution to their freedom struggle. This is what has motivated me in all that I have done in relation to the charges made against me in this case." So for Mandela, making this speech would not help him to get acquittal, because he will probably realize that the whole setting is unfair and unjust to the Black communities in South Africa. But he still made this speech in a way to address. It's more about the community story, the narratives, and the causes, the background of why he was charged and prosecuted on this crime, of this offense, and rebutting the legal technicality with addressing the moral cause the political cause of their actions. It's a way to also to disentrench, to rebut the state's attempt to try to neutralize this politically driven trial to a mere criminal trials, because simply focusing on legal technicality, simply focusing on whether the evidence are examined, accepted, whether there's a proof beyond reasonable doubt. These technical questions would not help us to understand the nature of this trial. And this is the same as another case in Taiwan in the Formosa trial in the 1980s, that when members from the opposition, from the so-called 党外人士, they were charged with security crimes, and they were sent to a military court for trial. Unfortunately, this trial was an open court trial. It was not a closed trial. So international media and local people can also attend and know and knew what has been happening during the hearings. And at the very beginning, the defendants were not aware of the fact that this was a politically driven trial. So they didn't think, they didn't even think of elevating this trial from a criminal trial in the military courts to a political trial, that they instrumentalize the courtroom, instrumentalize their opportunities to give speeches, to try to motivate the public ethos, to try to challenge the legitimacy of the military regime, and to explain the causes, the moral causes of their actions behind. And I guess this creates some caveats, of course, because I must mention, after all these struggles and total of discursive contentions in the courtroom, these defendants were also sent to a very long period of imprisonment. It didn't mean that...
Eric, you have 3 minutes. Sorry, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Even giving a very, very strong statement would not help them acquit. But this is something we need to be mindful of, that if we see the legal resistance and resilience is something people are desiring in autocratic regimes, that the outcome, the bright outcome will only come in a very long one. And I want to finish my presentation with two slides. One is what we can also learn the lessons if we keep engaging in this autocratic judiciary. When we knew that, or when people knew that in autocratic settings, they will always be compliant with the government. They were always in favor of the government's positionings in judicial outcomes. And some studies and some personal experience from lawyers in the Middle East also explain that even we may not be able to see a very positive outcome from their litigations, from their adjudications, but through the process of court hearings, they can request government information to be made public, and it creates an information utility. And they can also propose their own discourse in the courtroom and to be reported to the general public, to try to stimulate and to create or to counter the existing ideological legal norms with an alternative legal vision, alternative constitutional, legal, and judicial visions. And of course, by using the existing mechanisms to try to address disputes or human rights violations, is also a way to corner the courts, corner the judges, corner the prosecutors when they are giving unfavorable or illogical judgment in support of the government, or when they refuse to hear any filing of cases, that it also demonstrates that judicial independence will only be a facade. And the utility of incremental reform will also be possible when there are more cases filing to the existing system. They may not have a fundamental or revolutionary change, but in a way that there could be some incremental reforms or policy amendments or legislative amendments that could eventually favor the best interests of their clients. And back to Hong Kong, I guess because of the time, I would say now there are still many political trials going on in Hong Kong. And what are the contention in the courtroom? What are the solidarity in the courtroom and beyond the courtroom? I guess that is something we still need to study. And there are many good Hong Kong scholars have published excellent scholarly works on this, and I can share more in the Q&A session. But on the other hand, it's also important that to uphold the transparency of information access. And one of this commonality of this legal resistance in the courtroom is that the court remain open, the court remain transparent. People can still get access to the information. And by getting access to this legal information, we are also breaking two myths. First, judicial independence and the rule of law are something taken for granted. Through the information circulation, through reading the judgment, reading the rationale of this verdict, and knowing the course of hearings in these trials, people could realize whether judges and prosecutors are upholding their professional standards. And the second myth is that the legal knowledge is no longer upheld by a small group of legal elites. That, as Mandy and Kim also mentioned, the challenges of authoritarian legality and autocratic settings, limiting information, upholding information to a small group of political and professional elites would not be able to help building a communal norm, because if people are lacking knowledge and lacking access to the information, how can they realize their own rights? How can they know their entitlements? And how can we make sure these legal elites are not manipulating legal technicality for the sake of upholding the illiberal and autocratic regimes? So Mandy mentioned the recent tragedy in Hong Kong, the Taipo fire, and I also wrote the article at Jamestown Foundation to explain what does it reflect on a new form of authoritarian legality and what are the potential or possibilities for the local people to build resilience and resistance. So I can stop here, and I look forward to the conversations in the remaining time. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for this presentation, and thank you, Mandy, as well. Because I'm really conscious about the time, and because we need to close the conversation at this online space, I was thinking, and I want to know if Mandy will be okay with that we have a newsletter in RC48 called Grassroots, and we do 2 editions every year, and the next edition is in December. So what I was thinking is, if you don't mind, I will collect all the questions that I have already, that is almost 8-9 questions plus in the chat, and I will pass it to you, and maybe you can write the answers for the newsletter. So that will be a way for you to provide the answers to that questions, if that's okay for you both. That would be a good idea, and everybody will agree with that.
Yes, so, that would be perfect. Thank you so much, Camilo.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Eric. Yeah.
Sorry, can I just very quickly mention that to people who are researching in this area as well, because obviously this is part of ISA RC48. Myself and my collaborators from Poland, we have a special research stream on social trauma and resilience at the upcoming European Sociological Association conference in Warsaw this August, actually. So those of you who might be heading to maybe attending that conference in Warsaw, please get in touch, because we want to actually have an international collaboration on this issue, because we have a lot of accepted papers from Ukraine, from Germany, from different areas. So yeah, we should learn from each other. So thank you so much. Apologies for interrupting.
No, thank you, Mandy, and of course thank you to Professor Kidman for his really interesting comments. And thank you I'm going to check now, for the 623 people who has been with us through all this conversation. And as I said to you, I will collect the questions, and please check the next edition of Grassroots to see what Eric, Mandy, and Professor Kidman can reply to your questions. Have a good night, have a good morning, have a good afternoon, wherever the part of you are, and thank you for being here. And once again, thank you, Mandy, thank you, Eric, thank you, Professor Kidman, for being with us today.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Let's stay in touch.
Right.
Let's stay in
touch.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day, afternoon, night.